This is the first lecture that I am recording and posting, and it has to do with the origins of the Ketubah. If you should have your source sheet in front of you, which is entitled The Origins of the Ketubah. If you look at the first two psukim on the source sheet, they both mention the word mohar. Mohar is a bride price that was paid, to the father in the two cases mentioned in the Torah, and it was essentially what the father received in return for giving his daughter to the groom. So the first case, Aleph in Breshit, Perek Lamed Daled, Pasuk Yud Beit, involves Shechem saying to Yaakov and the brothers that he wishes to marry Dinah after he has raped her, and he says, Haru alai moar umatan. In other words, feel free to ask me for as much mohar and for as many gifts as you wish. I'm willing to give you all of that because I really want to marry Dinah. So mohar here is the bride price as opposed to matan, additional gifts that might be given. And this is even clearer in Beit, which is from Shemot, Perek Chav Beit. We have there a case of a man who seduces a virgin who is not betrothed, and we are told in Pasuk Tedvav that if this happens, Mahor Yimharenu Lo Liisha, he should mohar her such that she should become his wife. In other words, mohar here is being used as a verb, meaning essentially to betroth her by giving her mohar, by providing her with the bride price. But really, as you can see from the next verse, he's giving the money to the father rather than to her. And I'll just say it. I'm sorry I have to say this, but what is essentially going on here is that the man is purchasing, in some sense, this woman from her father, and the mohar that he provides is, and the fact that he marries her, is compensation for the fact that because he has had sex with her, she no longer can be married off as a virgin, and this is a financial loss to the father. So to avoid this, plus people will not want to marry her because of what happened. So to compensate for this, the man A has to marry her, and B has to pay the full mohar, the mohar that would be paid in the case of a woman who is a virgin. And in the next pasuk, Pasuk Tet Zayin, we're told, Ima'ein yima'ein avia letita lo, if the father does not wish to give his daughter as a wife to this man, then he nonetheless has to pay the amount of the mohar habetulo. And this is compensation, and he has to pay the full amount that normally would be paid for in the case of one who is marrying a virgin. Okay, so this is the story, biblically speaking. In the rabbinic period, while it is still true that men would give gifts at the beginning of a marriage, in the Gaonic period, there's something that is called the mukdam, which were gifts that were given by the groom to the woman directly or to her family when at the time of betrothal. Nonetheless, in any case, there was the institution of the Ketubah, and essentially what you have is that instead of front-loading a financial obligation on the part of the groom, it is back-loaded. In other words, no money has to be paid up front, but in the case of the dissolution of the marriage through divorce or the death of the husband, either he or his estate has to provide a certain amount of money to the woman. The rabbis set this amount at 200 zuz in the case of a virgin and 100 in the case of a woman who has been previously married, a divorcee or a widow. And these amounts, the amount of 200 zuz, was based on the Gimel, Pasuk in Devarim. Here we're dealing with a case of rape, and we are told that in the case of rape, in Pasuk Chavtet, we're told that the man who raped this woman, who was an unmarried virgin, has to pay 50 kesef, and must marry her because he has raped her and he may not divorce her. I'm not going to get into the question now of whether the woman herself would want to marry this man. Torah, unfortunately, doesn't address that, but for our present purposes, the amount that the man has to pay is 50 shkalim, and the rabbis say, apparently, that is the amount of the mohar. So they determine that the standard mohar is 50 shkalim, which translates into 200 zuz in the rabbinic period. Now, when does this institution of Ketubah first come into being? Historically, we can't say for sure, but according to rabbinic tradition, this is something that comes about in the time of Shimon ben Shetach. So if you look at the translation of the passage in Ketubot, Pei Beit Amud Beit, which is source Daled, and you look in the middle of that section, let's see, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down, 4 words from the end, we are told, so it was also taught elsewhere. At first they used to give merely a written undertaking in respect of the Ketubah of a virgin for 200 zuz, and in respect of that of a widow for a maneh, and consequently they grew old and could not take any wives. Apparently what this means is that initially the mohar system was in existence, and that means that men at the outset had to commit themselves for the appropriate amount of money, which means that they had to have that amount of money in hand at the time of marriage. And since it was difficult for men to put together that amount at the time that they married the woman, or they wanted to marry a woman, they would grow old, the men would grow old, or the women would grow old, and marriage would not take place. This is one interpretation. We'll go with that for now. The passage continues. It was then ordained that the amount of the Ketubah was to be deposited in the wife's father's house. Now there's some disjunction here. It's not clear how this follows from the previous statement, but in any case, we are now told that the system is that money is to be paid not at the beginning, or at least let's put it this way, that the money was not unconditionally given to the woman or to her father, but rather the money was to be left in the wife's father's house, and he could only claim that money at the moment that the marriage was dissolved or divorced. So men didn't actually have to pay out this amount of money at the time of marriage. The Talmud continues, at any time, however, when the husband was angry with her, he used to tell her, go to your Ketubah. In other words, since the money was out of the husband's hands already, he would be more likely to, if he were angry at the woman, just say, that's it, we're going to get divorced, the money is in my hands right now anyway, take your Ketubah, that's it. It was ordained, therefore, that the amount of the Ketubah was to be deposited in the house of her father-in-law, in other words, in the house of the father of the groom. And the idea here is, well, let's finish the passage. Wealthy women converted it into silver or gold baskets, while poor women converted it into brass tubs. In other words, this amount of money was turned into objects that of value that the women would be able to take in the case of the dissolution of the marriage. So the idea here is, so now the money is in the hands of the groom's father, which means that on the one hand, he can't put his hands on it and sell it or hide it, such that the money will not be there, or the objects will not be there in the case that the marriage is dissolved. But on the other hand, since this money or these objects are in his father's house, psychologically, he's less likely to simply say to the woman, I divorce you, because in a sense he has the property in hand, and he's going to be more reluctant to give it up. And the Talmud says, still with all of that, whenever the husband had occasion to be angry with his wife, he would say to her, take your ketubah and go. This was not a sufficient disincentive. Now, well, let's finish the passage and then I'll comment on it. It was then that Shimon ben Shetach ordained that the husband must insert the pledging clause, all my property is mortgaged to your ketubah. So the ketubah obligation was no longer limited to a particular set of objects or particular money that was deposited somewhere. The man had to pay the ketubah from whatever property he might have. And this idea is enshrined in the traditional ketubah, where the man says, I will pay the ketubah afilu min glima dal katpai, even from the shirt on my back. So what's going on here? What is the innovation of Shimon ben Shetach? Well, first of all, he is continuing or is refining a trend that exists already, which is that part of the function of the ketubah, the idea that a man had to pay out the money at the end of the marriage if it were dissolved rather than at the beginning, was, on the one hand, as we saw earlier, enabling men to marry earlier and not have to wait to accumulate that money and pay it over to the woman so that the money was no longer theirs. But B, the rabbis wished to discourage the dissolution of the marriage. In other words, they wanted to prevent the husband from hastily divorcing his wife, which, remember, he could do against her will. So by having this obligation that on the placing this obligation on the husband if he dissolved the marriage, this was a disincentive for him to dissolve the marriage. However, the Talmud says the various strategies that were used were apparently not effective. So Shimon ben Shetach came along. Shimon ben Shetach he was a contemporary of Alexander Jannaeus, who ruled from, I think it's 103 BCE to 76 BCE. So that gives you some sense of when Shimon ben Shetach was around. So what Shimon ben Shetach did was he said that now the husband is obligated to pay the ketubah from anything that he owns. So that means that he can't just take whatever has been designated for the ketubah and hide it somewhere or do something with it, misappropriate it, and say, well, the money or the objects from which you were supposed to receive the ketubah just aren't around, so you're out of luck. And B, he's now obligated to pay the ketubah. By being obligated to pay the ketubah from whatever he has, again, his experience will be that if he is to dissolve the marriage, were he to do so, he's going to have to pay out of whatever he has. So psychologically, again, the idea is that the ketubah that he's paying is not money that is already out of his hands, such that he might be more inclined to say, well, it's not in my hands right now anyway, so I'm going to divorce my wife and she'll take the money and that'll be it. But he will be more inclined to want to hold on to what he has, and therefore less likely to divorce his wife. And the Talmud says, I don't remember right now where it is, but the Talmud says in one place specifically that one of the functions of the Ketubah was so that it would not, husbands would not consider it an easy matter to divorce their wives. I do want to mention, I don't think I mentioned this earlier, that, and now we're not speaking history, but halacha, there are Rishonim who think that the Ketubah was a rabbinic institution, either it was instituted by Shimon ben Shetach, or at least in the form that it presently exists, because the rabbis do describe some kind of Ketubah arrangement existing earlier. And there are Rishonim who say, no, the Ketubah obligation is a biblical obligation, and what happens in the rabbinic period is just that the nature of the obligation is fine-tuned. We'll see that this has some consequences, halachically speaking, but again, this is not a historical observation, but just halachic debate. Okay.